could to keep things quiet for you. And we hope that you come back as excited to be here as we all are. Before I take questions on others.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Federal Reserve System, Janet L. Yellen of California to be Chairman of the Board of Governors.
Under the previous order, the time until 5:30 p.m. will be equally divided and controlled in the usual form. Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I hope that we will confirm Janet Yellen later today. I come to the floor for a few minutes to do as I have done most weeks since the failure of this Senate to pass common sense gun legislation in the spring of 2013, to talk about the number of Americans who have lost their lives due to gun violence. That number stands today at 12,041. 12,000 people have died at the hands of gun violence since December 14th, which of course is the day in which 26 and 7-year-olds lost their life in Newtown, Connecticut, and 6 teachers and professionals that were protecting them. This is probably the last time, Madam President, that we're going to have the chance to display this particular number, because the website that has been totaling this is going to stop doing so. And it's probably a good thing in this respect. Once that one became a crooked number, we weren't going to really have any room on this poster any longer. And at some point in the middle of next year, the one would click up to a 2. We'd be over 20,000 people killed due to guns. And frankly, Madam President, this doesn't even count the suicides. This is just the people who have died as a result of gun homicides. And the number just goes up and up and up at a rate that's hard to comprehend. And so I want to just talk for a few minutes about just a few of the representative victims that we have seen across the country in the last year that make up just a small subset of the 12,000 people, in a hope that maybe one of these days it will inspire this place to action. I was at the swearing in of the new mayor of New Haven on New Year's Day. Toni Harp is the first female mayor of New Haven, the 50th mayor of New Haven. She will inherit a city that is being absolutely ravaged by gun violence. 20 gun homicides in the last year, 67 shootings, and they all hurt, each one of them hurt, but the last one was particularly devastating. Javier Martinez died on December 28, 2013. Javier attended a local high school that was focused on learning about the environment and protecting the environment, Common Ground High School. And he was described as one of the most outstanding participants in the 20-year history of a program that was put on through that school, whereby kids spent part of their summer out in Block Island, a little island in between Connecticut and Rhode Island, whereby they worked to eliminate invasive species and spread the environmental gospel to visitors to that small island. He was beloved by his family and by his friends. He was thinking of becoming an arborist or an environmental scientist. His community, in particular his pretty sleepy neighborhood in which this shooting happened, has been absolutely torn apart through the loss of Javier. Bebo, he was called by his grandparents. But he's one of 20 people in New Haven, Connecticut that were lost. 12 of the 20 were under 30 years old. 11 of them were men. 17 of them were African American. That's the story in New Haven. It's young African American males who are dying almost every week. Part of the 12,041. Just a couple months earlier, John Allen Reed died due to a gunshot wound in Texas. Now, what makes John Allen Reed exceptional is that he was 5 years old, and he is one of dozens of accidental gun deaths that are happening all across this country. He and his 6-month-old sibling were in the care of a regular babysitter, but a babysitter who feared for her safety, and so she carried a gun with her, but she left the gun on a table. She fell asleep. The 5-year-old got the gun, and when she woke up to go try to find the kids, she found John dead with a fatal gunshot wound. We heard these stories all throughout 2013. I don't know statistically whether there were more in 2013 than in previous years, but because we don't require much, if any, training before you buy a gun, you have young babysitters leaving guns unattended with these absolutely devastating results. Or how about 4 months before that in Seattle, where Molly Connolly, a 15-year-old, a great goalie on her high school team, a straight-A student, was killed while she was walking back with friends after celebrating her recent birthday at a sleepover. Detectives believe a shooter opened fire on Molly Connolly and her group of friends. Her nickname was 4.0 because she was such a good student. She always smiled. She gave people smiles, and she was joyful and kind. She had a generous spirit, said Molly's mother. Molly and John and Javier are just 3 of the voices of victims that we need to start talking about here on the floor, because the statistics don't seem to be moving people to action. Maybe the stories will. And as I hope we will this year, let's be realistic about what we can do and what we can't do. I've come down here every week to talk about the stories of the people who have died at the hands of guns, but I understand that there is no law that is going to completely eradicate gun violence. And I understand that there is no one solution at hand that is going to have a radical transformation overnight. I believe this is about gun laws, but I also understand that it's about better mental health treatment. I also understand that it's about a culture of violence. I also understand that it's about a sense of hopelessness that a lot of kids feel in poor neighborhoods that lead them to violence as a way of solving common everyday disputes. And so I'm ready on the floor of the Senate to have a real, sober, dispassionate argument about what we can do together this year to try to make sure that this number in 2014 is just a little bit lower than it was in 2013. And with that in mind, I'll just leave you with this one last story, and that's the story of Zena Daniel. Zena Daniel took out a restraining order on her husband after years of violence and abuse. Police were reportedly called to this home dozens of times. Well, her husband was upset about that restraining order, and knowing that he couldn't get a gun at a retailer because he wouldn't pass a background check, he went online to Arms List. And within hours, he found a seller who would supply to him a .40 caliber Glock handgun that he picked up at a McDonald's parking lot for $500 cash. And the next day, he went into Zena's workplace and he murdered her and 2 other women. He injured 4 others. Zena's brother said this: "I'm a gun owner. I'm a hunter. I'm a member of the NRA. I believe in the Second Amendment, but I'm also a believer in sensible gun laws. I've seen how devastating gun violence can be, and I know that her husband never should have been able to buy a gun online without a background check. A background check would have saved my sister's life." I don't know what we'll be able to get done this year. I don't know that there are 60 votes in the Senate for the kind of expansion of background checks that many of us, including Zena's brother, would like to see. But let's not let a whole year go by without at least some attempt between senators of goodwill on both sides of the aisle so that when this number does come back up at the end of 2014, it's just a little bit lower. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to discuss an issue that's been on the forefront of many Americans' minds ringing in the new year, and that is extending benefits for the unemployed, something that's important, of course, for a lot of Americans. Before I begin, I want to thank my colleague and friend from Rhode Island, Senator Jack Reed, for his hard work and effort on this behalf. As we work together, our staffs have worked together to get this proposal moved forward for today's vote. And I hope that my friends and colleagues here in the Senate enjoyed their holidays, and that everyone returned refreshed and ready to tackle some of the tough issues that we have here in 2014. Unfortunately, while Congress was in recess, approximately 17,000 Nevadans greeted the new year not with the optimistic expectations of a fresh start, but with the anxiety about how they're going to feed their families or perhaps even pay their utility bills. When Congress left Washington, D.C. in December, a lot of important matters were left undone and expired. As a result, millions of Americans were left with no idea whether or not their employment benefits were going to be fixed retroactively, something that has become, of course, all too common for this Congress to do. Helping those in need should not be a partisan issue. Providing a limited social net is one of the responsibilities of the federal government. Unfortunately, instead of planning ahead, figuring out the best way to do that, we are now forced to decide whether or not to reinstate these benefits after they've expired. We should provide some relief to the millions of Americans that were left hanging when Congress went home in December and temporarily extend unemployment benefits for the next 3 months. It is the right thing to do. That short period will help these families whose benefits expired abruptly while Congress works out a longer-term solution that provides Americans with some certainty and is fiscally responsible. I understand my colleagues' concerns about the cost and their desires to pay for this extension. I, too, want to see our federal debt brought under control, and I think my voting record is proof of that concern. I, too, believe that Congress should be more focused on passing laws that actually help create jobs. Growing our economy should be the primary focus and concern of this body. As a senator of the state that leads the nation in unemployment, believe me, I understand the importance of refocusing on jobs. I'd rather be down here discussing today innovative ways of creating jobs instead of the need to extend unemployment benefits yet again. But, Madam President, because of this administration and even some of the choices of this body, unfortunately, our economy is not growing quickly enough, and many Americans are still hurting, including a lot of Nevadans. My state is struggling. I've repeated often on this floor that Nevada consistently tops the chart in unemployment, bankruptcies, and in foreclosures. The statistics are surely revealing. But more startling is the obvious increase in impoverished Nevadans that I meet when I go home. And I'd like to share an example, Madam President. Every Thanksgiving, one or two of my children join me in serving Thanksgiving dinner to folks in Reno who are in need and cannot cook a Thanksgiving meal for themselves. This year, my daughter Emmy, in her freshman year in college, joined me in this experience. Every year, that dinner sees more and more attendees. Every year, the number of individuals and families who need help increases. This year, the venue was absolutely packed. When my daughter and I arrived, the line was 4 blocks long outside that venue. It is such an obvious example of how so many Nevadans are unable to provide for their basic needs, and this cannot be ignored. I know that many economists point to a national employment rate that's improving, but at home, we don't feel it. The unemployment rate in Nevada has consistently far exceeded the national average. In fact, the Silver State has led the nation for the past 3 years in unemployment, and the results are, of course, people in Nevada are really hurting. It is difficult to stand here in the nation's capital, an area that has largely felt little negative impact of the recession, and describe just how tough times are for so many of my constituents. At these Thanksgiving dinners, I hear about choices individuals are forced to make, whether to buy gas for their car, pay for heat in the frigid northern Nevada weather, or to buy school supplies for their children, or perhaps save for the future. These are hard-working individuals who rely on these benefits. They are trying to find a job. They want to provide for their children, but for these benefits to simply vanish without giving families a time to plan or figure out alternatives to help them get by, to me, is just not right. I, too, understand the concerns about the cost of these benefits. I would prefer to see them paid for in a manner that does not burden our nation with more debt. I have previously introduced legislation that would do just that. Legislation that would extend unemployment benefits while still paying for them. At the time, I introduced my legislation as an alternative to a more costly bill because I think it's important to bring our nation's debt down. I'm ready to work with my colleagues to introduce similar legislation again this year. But in the meantime, I propose that we pass this short extension now, that we would allow Congress the opportunity to spend the next 3 months debating how to pay for these benefits in the future, or perhaps how much longer they should be extended. Those are important questions worthy of more debates. But in the meantime, Congress simply must provide some temporary relief for those who are unemployed. Paying for these benefits would be the best approach. Congress could have taken the harder road to figure out a way to do that before departing for the holiday break and leaving millions of Americans hanging. But they didn't. So let's pass this short-term extension and focus on a more fiscally responsible solution for the longer term. Madam President, thank you, and I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, waiting for senators to appear as they make their way back from their winter break, this first day back in session. Today, working on a bill to extend long-term unemployment benefits for 3 months, which affect more than 1 million people who receive those benefits. And also today, planning on taking a final vote on the confirmation of Federal Reserve Chair nominee Janet Yellen. And that's scheduled for about an hour from now, 5:30 Eastern Time. And a second vote scheduled today on moving forward on that unemployment insurance benefits. That's set to be held after the Janet Yellen vote. Now, we were watching earlier today's White House briefing with spokesman Jay Carney. We're going to take another look at that. Gene Sperling, the director of the National Economic Council, spoke at the beginning of the briefing.
Well, you know, as I said, I mean, the president called for it 7 times in 18 days. He called just as many of us were leaving. Reid and Heller put their proposal forward. The president, from his vacation, called both senators, asked how he could help. The administration's been out there continually. So you may have noted that we don't always have 100% control over the United States Congress. But I think the record's pretty clear that the president and his White House and Secretary of Labor have aggressively been pushing for this, both in December, both in the break, and as quickly as possible as we've returned.
Gene, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Gene, is this the last time that we're going to hear from you in this role or in this administration from this podium? And if so, is there any sort of thoughts about the economy or tax for you that you wanted to share?
Well, I don't know when Jay's asking me back. I will probably be here for all of January and probably quite a lot of February as well. Jeff and I were talking yesterday, and I'm quite confident that when March comes, I will be somewhere else.
Can you talk broadly? Given all your experience, can I ask you one broad question?
Yeah.
A lot of stories this weekend and today on the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty.
Yeah.
You served in the Clinton administration, you saw the Bush years, and now the Obama years. These policies, I think, broader point, obviously, have been building for a long time, decades, the problem of poverty. But you were talking a moment ago about historic levels of long-term unemployment.
Right.
46 million people still in poverty.
Right.
How much responsibility does the president bear after having 5 years in office for at least some of his policies to take hold?
Well, look, on the broader question, I think there's no question that the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson declared 50 years ago Wednesday has made very important advances. There's just no question. I mean, in 1963, 51% of African Americans were in poverty and about 25% had graduated from high school. I think that one of the things you have heard us talk about, and I think you'll see our Jason Furman, our Council of Economic Advisors, talking about more, is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has now started, our government has started looking at a broader measure of poverty that makes sure that we're looking at all the things that affect how people are doing, including things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, food stamps. And I think when you look at that measure, that you would find that poverty has come down close to 40%, perhaps 35 to 40% since then. So there has been important progress. And I think it is important to understand that many of the things that have been done over the last 20 years have mattered. So, for example, when I was first here in '93, there was probably about 1.7 million Americans that were above the poverty line because of the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, because of measures that have been done over the last 20 years, including President Obama extending the Earned Income Tax Credit more for people with 3 children or more, reducing the marriage penalty, and extending those, and there's 6 million people out of poverty. When you look at the refundable tax credits and the child tax credit and the ITC together, it may be as many as 9 million people not being in poverty. Now, I think when you look over this, I think you I think there's no question over the last 50 years things have been done wrong, but I think we've learned some lessons. I think that both Democrats and Republicans have learned you have to look at to make sure about the incentives you're creating, and that policies are better if they are designed to reward work. One of the reasons earned income tax credit has been so important is that it's an incentive for work. You get that assistance as you are working. That has positive incentives, and it's given positive support for the program. And just to give an example, going back to 1993, when you look at the alternative poverty measure, the broader poverty measure, the poverty rate was actually lower in 2010, 2011 than it was in 93. So my first time in office here, a year or two after a very mild recession, poverty was higher than it was after the worst downturn since the Great Depression. So look, we should be judging and looking at all the different things that we are doing. We should be willing to reform. But I think that there's things that this president has done that have made a big difference. Center for Budget and Policy Priorities estimated that as many as 8 million people were not in poverty because of things done in the Recovery Act. The fact that when we've been in these budget agreements, while everybody else is focused on what's going to happen to the middle class tax relief and the upper income tax relief, that the president has made a priority to fight for extending the earned income tax credit, the refundable part of the American Opportunity Tax Credit, the child tax credit, has shown his commitment. There's no politics in that, not even much attention. It's just in his heart. And I'll tell you one other thing that would make a big difference. There's a very smart professor, Professor Dubé, University of Massachusetts Amherst, who just came out with a report that many of you saw the last few days that said if we were to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 in the staged way it's projected by the Harkin-Miller legislation, that would lift 6.8 million people out of poverty. It would make them less dependent on government programs. It would not add to the deficit one penny, but it would reward work and reduce poverty. And those are some of the things that you're going to hear from this president now in the State of the Union, and more importantly, those are things that we're going to fight to get done. And if anybody suggests that somehow we want to fight for the minimum wage or extending emergency unemployment for political reasons as opposed to it being the right thing to do, well, I have a really good solution. Let's get them done right now in a bipartisan way, then everybody can share credit in doing something that's the right thing for the American people. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Gene. Any other questions? Julie.
Thanks, Jay. I had a couple questions about the situation in Iraq. Secretary Kerry said that this is a fight that belongs to the Iraqis, but I'm wondering if the President feels any kind of special responsibility for assisting the Iraqis given the very recent history between these two countries.
Well, the United States maintains a strong relationship and commitment with and to the government of Iraq, and we remain in close contact, both from Washington and our embassy in Baghdad, with Iraq's political leaders about how we can continue to support the government's efforts to defeat al-Qaeda, what's known now as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is the al-Qaeda umbrella group there. We have, as Secretary Kerry said, made a significant commitment to helping the Iraqi government in dealing with that situation. And what Secretary Kerry's point also was, and I think this is a broader point about conflicts in the region, is that this is something for the Iraqis to take the lead on and handle themselves. But that doesn't mean that we cannot assist them, and we're working closely with the Iraqis to develop a holistic strategy to isolate the al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and we have seen some early successes in Ramadi, as you know, where tribal forces and police, with the Iraqi army providing support, appear to have
a lot of discussions on the floor concerning a number of things that have happened in the last couple of weeks, not the least of which is what's going on in the Antarctica right now, the fact that some people had to be lifted out. It's kind of interesting, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand that I am reviving a lot of the previous interest in the global warming thing for any reason other than the fact that right now, after it has been determined without any doubt that the sentiment in the House and the Senate would never pass anything like cap and trade. But the problem is this president is now doing through regulation what he could not do through legislation. And that's the expense that I am concerned about. You know, in a minute I want to talk about the cost of these things, but we have a real serious problem in this country. People are concerned about the spending. They're concerned about what's happening to our military. They're concerned about a lot of the issues, but it's overlooked quite often, the cost of the overregulation that is taking place in our society. If you ask any of the Farm Bureau, any of the ag community out there, what their major problem is, they'll tell you that it's the overregulations by the Environmental Protection Agency that's really making it difficult for them to survive. Now, the same thing is true with manufacturers, with producers, and others. But when you look at the crown jewel of all regulations, it is cap and trade. Cap and trade would constitute the largest tax increase in the history of this country. And I think it's kind of interesting that what's happening right now up in the Antarctica is something that really has been happening now for quite a long period of time. While there's been a concerted effort of people to believe that global warming is taking place and we're all going to die and all of that, at the same time, the evidence out there is it's almost laughable. In January of 2004, I remember when Al Gore held a global warming rally in New York City. It was one of the coldest days in New York City in its history. In March of '07, a Capitol Hill media briefing on the Senate climate bill was canceled due to a snowstorm. In April of '07, global warming rallies greeted by unseasonable snow. Several of them were canceled. In October of '07, Gore's global warming speech at Harvard University coincided with temperatures that nearly broke a 125-year temperature record. In October of, it wasn't just here, in October of '07, the British House of Commons held a marathon debate on global warming during London's first October snowfall since 1922. December of 2008, Al Gore spoke to an audience in Milan. And by the way, I was there during this thing in Milan, Italy, about global warming. Outside, it is snowing, a rare event in that area. Snow and freezing rain also strike Rome, Naples, Palermo, and Sicily. That's kind of interesting. A lot of people are not aware that the ones that were responsible for the whole global warming movement was the United Nations, and it was an effort which I won't go into now unless it becomes appropriate at a time when there is more time to talk about it. The United Nations has one big party every year. It's usually in December, and it's what we call the Global Warming Party. It's where all the countries come in, and it's you know, all you can eat, all you can drink, the biggest party of the year. I can remember going to one of these annual parties when there was someone from a sub-Saharan African country. It was actually Benin. Someone was there and participating in this, and I went up to this person and I said, now, you can't tell me you believe all this stuff, because the whole idea was the 192 countries that go to this meeting every year are ones that make a commitment to believing that global warming is taking place, and we're all going to have to start doing things that would destroy our economies to try to preclude it from happening. His response was, oh, no, but this is the biggest party of the year, and we were there. Well, that happened in Milan, Italy. That was 2008. I always remember that one because they had my picture on telephone poles saying wanted, and I saved several of those, brought them back to the United States, and actually distributed them among people who were enjoying it quite a bit. Anyway, in Milan, at the time, the whole meeting there was about global warming and set records on the snow and freezing rain. And then the big, in March of 2009, Nancy Pelosi, at that time, she was the Speaker of the House. She had a big global warming rally that was supposed to be the largest one at that time ever taken place in this country, and it was snowed out. February 2010, the Senate EPW, Environment and Public Works, At that time, I was the ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee. They had a hearing entitled "The Global Warming Impacts, Including Public Health in the United States," and it was canceled due to a major snowstorm. This goes on and on and on. And one thing that was not on the list that should be on this list of what happened in Copenhagen in 2009. Yeah, in 2009, that was the annual party of the United Nations, and I remember it so well because people were trying to go over there and say that the United States of America is going to pass cap and trade, and we encourage all of you to do it. And I'm going from memory now, but I'm quite sure that at that time the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had been there, Nancy Pelosi had been there, Barack Obama had been there, John Kerry had been there. At that time, he was a member of the United States Senate, all of them assuring these people that these 191 countries, that we were going to pass cap and trade. And I remember wanting to go over as a one-man two squad, which I did. I went all the way over and all the way back to spend 3 hours on the ground. And I have to say, Madam President, it's probably the most enjoyable 3 hours I've ever spent, because I was able to tell them the truth that under no circumstances were we in the United States going to pass the largest tax increase in history based on trying to stop something they at that time were calling global warming. And the 191 people that attended there all had one thing in common, that is they all hated me. But nonetheless, I was telling them the truth, and they tried to pass it again and again. It is never, there are not probably 35 votes in the United States Senate right now that would vote for a cap and trade, which would constitute the largest tax increase in the history of this country. So now all that was taking place over a long period of time. And then we see, bring us up to 2013 and 2014, just in November, President Obama issued an executive order on climate change stating, and this is excessively high temperatures are already harming natural resources, the economies, and public health nationwide. I guess if you say something long enough, sooner or later people are going to believe it because they assume that if the president says it, it must be true. In January 6th, AccuWeather issued a warning that a blast of Arctic air would deliver some of the coldest weather in 20 years to the midsection of the United States. Meteorologist Ryan Maule, that's M-A-U-E, of Florida, said about the historic cold outbreak, quote, "If you're under 40 years old, you've not seen this stuff before." The National Weather Service reported that Chicago O'Hare Airport's temperatures hit 16 degrees below zero on January 6th, breaking the negative 14-degree record set in 1884. And this makes Chicago colder than the South Pole, where it was 11 degrees below zero. The average temperature in the United States on January 6th was 12.8%. And I say all this because this is what is kind of a predicate to what's happening right now. On November 27th, the research expedition to gauge the effect of climate change on the Antarctica began. This is the one that's in the news today. On December 24th, the day before Christmas, a Russian ship carrying climate scientists, journalists, tourists, and crew members for the expedition became trapped in deep ice up to 10 feet thick. An Australian icebreaker was sent to rescue the ship, but on December 30th, efforts were suspended due to bad weather. And then on January 2nd, a Chinese icebreaker, and there come the Chinese in now, called the Zulong, sent out a helicopter that airlifted 52 passengers from the Russian ship to safety in the Australian icebreaker. The Chinese vessel is now also stuck in ice along the Russian with the Russian vessel. 22 Russian crew members are still on board the Russian ship, and an unreported number of crew members remain on the Chinese ship. January 5th, the U.S. Coast Guard was called to assist the ships that were stuck in the Antarctic. Now, that's what's happening today. That's going on right now. But let's go back and relive a little bit of the history when I was under a lot of criticism because I was opposed to the assertions by Al Gore that the New York Times said might arguably be the world's first environmental billionaire. On December 2008, Gore said, quote, "The entire North polarized cap will disappear in 5 years." Wait a minute, that was not 2008. So right now, it's 5 years later, and it hasn't disappeared yet. In fact, we've been reading about it. December 13th, the BBC reports that the Arctic ice cap coverage is close to 50% more than in the corresponding period of 2012. That means it's increasing by 50% over this period of time. This is the same ice cap that Gore said was going to disappear 5 years ago. President Obama in May of this last year, quote, "The climate is warming faster than anybody anticipated 5 or 10 years ago." To contrast with The Economist, they said over the past 15 years, air temperatures at the Earth's surface have been flat. Gina McCarthy, she's the one who's recently sworn in and is the director of the Environmental Protection Agency. She said extreme weather events are proof enough to me to show why action is necessary. We're talking about action. That is passing the largest tax increase in the history of America on CO2. According to the preliminary reports, 2013 turned out to be one of the least extreme weather years on record, which is right after she made that statement. But the one I enjoyed so much was, and I had a lot of respect for Gina's predecessor, is Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson came in as director of the Environmental Protection Agency, and I remember her very well because I asked her the question. Now, keep in mind, she was appointed by President Obama. Her job is to make people think that global warming is taking place and all these extreme things are going to happen. And I asked her the question I said, in the event that we did the action, at that time there are 2 or 3 bills, cap-and-trade bills, that were offered in the House and in the Senate. And I said, now let's assume that one of these bills passes. Would this reduce CO2 worldwide? Her reaction was no, because this is just in the United States. This is not where the problem is. And so by their own admission, even if we were to sustain the economic disaster that we would have to have in the event that we passed one of these, it would not impact or reduce the levels of CO2. Another recent study, 15-year pause, Nature magazine said for this period, 1998 to 2012, the observed trend of temperature is not significantly different from zero and suggests a temporary hiatus in global warming. This was a magazine, a publication that was kind of leading the charge at one time for it. So we see these things that are happening, and we see that even though time and time again, just the reverse is true, we are going through this thing. I always have to go from memory when I go back, and I can remember in the earlier years of this, some 12 years ago, when they were looking at the Kyoto Treaty. You remember the Kyoto Treaty? I say to the presiding officer, that took place and was an agreement that we would sign on to a international treaty, the Kyoto Treaty, and we would agree to reduce all of these the CO2 in this country and all of that. And of course that didn't happen, but the cost was discussed at that time. I remember back when Republicans were a majority, I chaired the committee called the Environment and Public Works Committee, and some 12 years ago, about the time of Kyoto, I believed it was true. Everybody said that global warming is coming and we're all going to die. And so I assumed that it was true until I started exploring a little bit and hearing quietly from some of the scientists, look, the whole thing is rigged, and the science is not in the same as the United Nations would have you believe. And so one by one they started coming forth. And I stood at this podium for about a 3-year period and started naming all the scientists who had said that the United Nations scientists, the IPCC, were not being honest with they had their own agenda that they're trying to support. So at that time, a group of several universities, MIT was one of them, the Wharton School, a lot of their scientists came up and they said what the cost would be if we were to pass global warming legislation that had been proposed would be between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, $300 to $400 billion a year, yes, that would constitute the largest tax increase. I took this to my state of Oklahoma. I did my calculation as I always do. I get the number of people who file federal tax returns and have to pay taxes, and it would be about $3,000 a year per family. And yet, by their own admission, as Lisa Jackson said, it would not reduce overall temperature, even if you believe that that was a problem, which I don't. Well, anyway, the cost, Charles Rivers came along with a very similar cost. It was $350 billion a year. And so with all those costs in there, we wanted to look at it and see if, in fact, the science was there. We determined it was not. Well, if you look at the regulations of the EPA right now, the National Association of Manufacturers has a cumulative impact study, not including ozone or the greenhouse gases, of $630 billion annually and some 9 million jobs lost. Ozone, the regulations on ozones, 77 counties would be out of attainment in my state of Oklahoma. That's all of our counties. They'd all be out of attainment. That means we'd have job losses in all of those. Utility MAC, that cost $100 billion, and that's already been implemented. That affected all the coal states around in a major way. And the boiler MAC was one that the cost there would be $63 billion. And I mentioned and the BLM, the Bureau of the hydraulic fracturing regulations would cost about $100,000 per well. That's an increase that everyone else would have to pay in terms of what for producing right now. Greenhouse gas costs would be between $300 and $400 billion, as I mentioned before. Now, if you just take these regulations, the list is a lot longer than that, Madam President, but these regulations, this is a huge thing. This is the problem, the major problem we're having with the economy right now. Nobody seems to understand it. No one seems to care. And I think that a time to bring this up as an issue again is right now because of what is happening, what has been publicized recently, and so it's our intention to continue to do that. You know, this has been a relentless 4.5, 5-year war that the President has on fossil fuels. It's not just coal, but it's coal, oil, gas, and other fossil fuels. And the sad part of this is we could be completely independent from all other countries, certainly from the Middle East, from any other country, in terms of supplying our own energy in this country. All we'd have to do is do the same thing and allow drilling, exploration on federal public lands as we're doing throughout the country. Right now we've had a 40% surge increase in these exploration and production in this country, and at the same time we've had a 40% increase overall. And that is on state land and on private land. We've had a reduction on federal land. So we have a solution to the problem there, and I think that one of the things that we can do to help people to understand is to let them know that what they've been listening to, what the EPA has been telling our people, where our kids are learning in school, this whole thing on global warming, this is something that now people are now realizing that this is something that was not factual. Well, you know, we are so inundated right now with problems. We have problems in Afghanistan. We have problems with our foreign policy in the Middle East. We're all concerned about Mogadishu. We're all concerned about the problems around the world. But the area that people aren't talking about is the cost of the overregulation in America that is doing probably as much damage as all the rest of the problems are doing at this time. So I only want to submit for the record that some things are happening today that I think the American people need to look at. And I think that those statements that we made, which I'll come to the floor and talk about later on, 12 years ago and 10 years ago, are now become a reality. With that, I will yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Madam President,
Senator from Alabama.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I would ask to be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, there is no doubt that our employment situation in America is not good. Unemployment remains persistently high long after the administration has told us the recession is over. The growth that has been projected year after year has not been at the level that the experts have projected. CBO has missed the growth levels. The Federal Reserve has missed the growth levels. We've come in below that consistently. Growth is not where we need it to be. There's just no doubt about it. So we have a serious unemployment situation. Perhaps the most grim concept that we need to be well aware of is that workforce participation, that is the percentage of Americans in the working age group that are actually working, is lower today than at any time since the 1970s. That's a stunning statistic. Not since women entered the workforce in large numbers have we seen such low workforce participation numbers. So I would say that first and foremost, an unemployment extension bill is treating the symptoms of the problem. It's an aspirin for a fever, but the fever has been raging for weeks now. Something is causing it, and we need to deal with the cause of it rather than continuing to treat the symptoms. So I think that's so important for us to remember. And also this nation is struggling economically for a number of reasons. One of them clearly is the size of our debt. Our debt is so large, $17+ trillion now, that it is causing uncertainty in the economic markets, and we've got to get our spending under control. We have to do that. We cannot continue every time we have a desire to do something good to borrow the money to pay for it. So the unemployment bill that's before us today makes no attempt whatsoever to find spending reductions in other areas of this monstrosity of a government, but borrows every penny of it. They say it's $6 billion. Well, it's $6 billion for 90 days, 3 months. It's $26 billion over the full year. That's a huge sum of money. We just had a big dispute over cutting retirement pay that military people have earned, and it was a dispute over $4 billion. And that was over 10 years, $4 billion over 10. This is $6 billion over 3 months. So this is a lot of money, and efforts should have been made to try to find offsetting reductions in wasteful spending that occur throughout here before we go again to treat a symptom of a disease. But the tragedy is that the policies of this administration are driving this poor growth record. It just is. First and foremost, the proposals have been to tax more. Taxing the private sector will not create growth no matter who you tax. It will not be a growth-producing idea to tax the economy. And experts tell us that. The Congressional Budget Office tells us that. So this is what we've been seeing every year. The budget that passed out of this Senate, the budget that was proposed by the President of the United States, the budget passed the Senate with every single, I think, virtually every single Democratic senator voting for it and all Republicans opposing it, would have increased taxes $1 trillion and increased spending $1 trillion. The taxes weren't used to reduce our deficit. as this balanced approach seems to suggest. We have a balanced approach to reduce our deficits. We're going to tax some and cut spending some. Oh, no, they didn't cut spending at all. Their plan, their 10-year budget plan, called for raising taxes $1 trillion and raising spending $1 trillion. Tax and spend, that's what it is. It was on the floor of the Senate. There's no dispute about that. No one argues about it. But we have agreed to a certain level of spending here to try to bring our economy under control, the Budget Control Act, and we've acknowledged that on both sides of the aisle and independent experts that we need to reduce spending, and we need to contain the growth of spending, and we need to reduce the deficits that are adding to the weakness of our economy and uncertainty in our economy and creating risk in our economy. So this bill borrows every penny of it. Just a total violation of promised fiscal responsibility. It just is. It just is. I wish it weren't so. I wish we could just do this, and it wouldn't cost anything. But it will cost, and it will hamper growth in our country. And there are other problems here. We need more American energy. Energy produced in America creates jobs in America. It creates wealth in America. It keeps us from exporting large amounts, billions and billions of dollars to Venezuela and the Middle East and other places around the globe. And we could be producing that energy here, creating jobs here, keeping that wealth at home here, strengthening our economy and creating growth. That's what we should be doing. The administration has blocked American energy. They've dragged their feet in every shape, form, and fashion, whether it's moratoriums in the Gulf and blocking in Alaska, blocking the pipeline for our neighbors in Canada, and blocking production on public lands. This is not the way to create an economy. We need a tax system that's not always going up, but is more growth-oriented, simpler, more focused on creating growth. We need to eliminate every unnecessary regulation that burdens the American competitive marketplace and makes us less competitive globally, and instead of adding to them. And we've never seen anything like the plethora of new regulations being issued day after day, week after week, month after month, many of them challengeable constitutionally as being beyond the power of bureaucrats to issue, because Congress didn't pass the law to justify it. And it's driving up the cost of energy. It's driving up the cost of production and widgets in America, making us less able to compete with foreign competitors. And we need to stand up for American workers and American manufacturing on the world stage. It's time to tell our trading partners, we're willing to trade with you, big boy, but you got to play by the rules. This idea that you can violate the rules and we're still going to treat you as a great trading partner has got to be over. We need to stand up for the American worker on the world stage. It just has got to be done. And finally, at a time of high unemployment, should we not ask ourselves why the President of the United States and virtually every Democrat and a number of Republicans voted to double the number of workers that would come into America under this comprehensive immigration bill? We admit 1 million a year legally, and we believe in immigration. We support immigration, but at some point, you're bringing in workers to take jobs from unemployed Americans, so now we're here trying to extend unemployment to help unemployed Americans. Is there no common sense in this body? How can this possibly be? But that's the deal. And I know Senator Reid and Senator Leahy were on the floor earlier today. And they said we got to pass this comprehensive immigration bill. It would not end the illegality, reduce it only by about 40%, according to the Congressional Budget Office, but it would double the number of guest workers coming in. Guest workers, by definition, are people coming to take jobs. And while wages down, One reason is Professor Borjas at Harvard, who studied this extensively, the Federal Reserve in Atlanta, who've examined this extensively, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has examined it. And what do they find? They find that for middle and lower income workers, their wages are significantly adversely impacted by this unprecedented flow of immigrant labor into America. And I don't have anything against the people who want to come to America and work. They're good people. They want to have a job. I understand that. But any nation has to ask itself, what is the right amount? How many people can you absorb without causing millions of Americans to lose their job? And we now have to come to the floor of the Senate to ask what we can do to help them in this period of pain that they're going through. So, I just want to say a couple of things. We can do something now for the unemployed, but we need to be paying for it. We need to be staying within the spending limits that we've agreed to. We do not need to pass any more laws that increases the amount of money we borrow. We borrow enough. For heaven's sakes, we borrow too much right now. And it threatens our financial future, as expert after expert have told us. They've told us we are running a high risk, and nothing could be worse. Nothing could be worse for working Americans, and if we have some other new financial crisis to spring up in the months or years to come because we were irresponsible today. Wouldn't that be a disaster? Wouldn't that be a disaster? It certainly would. So I would just urge our colleagues to begin to focus on the underlying disease here, and that is policies of an administration that's produced the slowest post-recession recovery maybe the nation has ever had, except for the Great Depression, because it's tax more, regulate more, borrow more. That's all it is. And it won't work systemically to put us on the right path. So I know this is a tough challenge for us, but I'm convinced that if this Congress puts its mind to it, there are more than a few places we can find waste, fraud, and abuse to help pay for, to assist those who've been unemployed for a long time. I believe we can absolutely do better than we are today about that, and I hope that we will do so. And it's not right to just say the only people who care about American workers and care about those who are unemployed are those of us who are willing to forget our budget limitations, to forget our financial responsibilities, and just borrow more and spend more. And somehow this is going to fix the problem that we are facing. It will not. It will not fix the problem. In fact, it's creating the very disease that's causing workers to be suffering today. So, Madam President, I appreciate the opportunity to share these remarks. And I'll repeat again, we are seeing very tough times for the American worker. Particularly the lower income workers are having a difficult time, and there are many causes for it. But just taxing more, spending more, and borrowing more is one of the big causes of the problems we have today. And we're not going to fix that problem by even more of the same policies that got us into the situation we're in today. I thank the Chair and would yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
I would ask permission to speak for about 10 minutes on the Yellen nomination.
Without objection.
Over the past 5 years, the Federal Reserve has pursued unconventional